before we jump right into the text, I just want to say a few things about the way about how I think, well, how I'd like to approach the text. I don't know if have you had a chance to look at the text in Hungarian even?
Not
You can,
Hungarian.
no, probably. Okay.
I mean,
You're going to
French, yes, but
What?
Hungarian not.
Okay. You're going to find that it's inhospitable. That's what I like to call inhospitable texts, which is funny because Levinas talks a lot about hospitality. It's not friendly. He writes you could even say it's obscurantist. He's obscure. He is unnecessarily obscure. He belongs to a French tradition of writing where they think that the harder it is to understand what I'm saying, the deeper it must be. So it's annoying. It's truly annoying how he writes. Of course, the advantage to it is that there's a certain poetic power. When you write poetically, you're able to say things that you can't when you don't speak poetically. But in philosophy, it gets annoying, and when you're breaking your head trying to understand an idea, it becomes annoying, the poetry of it. So I'm apologizing first of all for letting us on that account. The one thing that is also not so great but useful is that he's aphoristic. If you know what I mean by that, it's an aphoristic style. He likes to write. His sentences have a very regular type of rhythm to them. He doesn't start with a subordinate clause. He often starts the right. So it becomes kind of annoying. And each sentence he writes each sentence as if he's crafted it for a couple of hours. I worked 5 hours on this sentence. I'm going to work 5 hours on the next sentence. So, okay, it's beautiful, but again, it's not necessarily, there isn't a philosophical argument there. It's not like I said something and I'm going to build, come to a conclusion. Sometimes there is a bit of that, but not really. So on the one hand, it's annoying. On the other hand, it makes it easier for us here to read it because we can take bits and pieces and we get a picture of what he's trying to say without systematically going through the whole thing. This book is too big to go systematically throughout the whole thing properly. One way to do it is to ask you to read it, and then I would come in and summarize the ideas and develop them. But I don't like to approach teaching texts that way. I prefer to read it together, and I mean really read it line by line. And I guess my approach is a little bit Talmudic that way, and to analyze what we're reading. To read it slowly, so it means we're not going to cover a lot, but at least we're going to learn to read. That's the key. At least we'll learn how to read Levinas. If we're not going to get the whole Weltanschauung that Levinas develops in this course, but we'll learn how to read a couple of passages, what I think are some key passages, and you'll have an idea what he wants to say. There's something that Levinas says in a couple of places, which is very helpful for me as a protocol for reading, which I like the French. He doesn't use this French phrase, Derrida does actually, but I find it a very useful French phrase, vouloir dire. I may have mentioned this in the past to you guys. In French, one of the ways, a dominant way of saying meaning, when I mean something, you say, je veux dire. I mean. Now, je veux dire literally means I want, je veux, I want, dire, to say. But it means I mean. So when they translate, for example, the English word meaning or the German word Bedeutung into French, they'll say vouloir dire, as if it means meaning. But the beauty of the French expression comes in the fact that says, I want to say. In other words, I'm saying something, but that's not what I want to say. I'm saying something, and you're not going to get the meaning of what I am saying until I say again what I want to say. I have to come back to what I said and to tell you now what I wanted to say. So that beautiful French phrase in a way tells you what exactly is meaning. Meaning is not necessarily what you just said. Meaning is what you wanted to say. you have to revisit your text. Now, Levinas, again, doesn't use this phrase, but he does he uses an expression a number of times. On page 91, for example, he uses this expression of assistance, this word assistance. He says, speech consists in the other human being, coming to the assistance of the sign given forth, attending to his own manifestation in the signs, redressing, answering the equivocal by his attendance. The equivocal, the thing that is ambiguous, the meaning is equivocal. I don't know what it means exactly. And therefore the person who spoke, whatever he or she spoke, revisits, redresses what was just spoken, comes to by his attendance, by his personal attendance upon the phrase. In other words, when I speak, and this for Levinas, this is what conversation is, as opposed to, example, writing. The problem with writing is once you write things down, it's there for good. It's like, words on a tombstone. There's a beautiful phrase by Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno, who says, he says in his great work, The Tragic Sense of Life, he says, now that I've written my words down on the page, they stare back at me like cadavers from a cemetery. The words are dead, lying dead on the page. That's part of the fate of writing. Levinas says that in conversation, and now I take this as a protocol for reading though, but he says the beauty of conversation is that I say something and it's inevitable that either you will misunderstand what I am saying, or just as inevitable that I will have said what I meant to say. I say it in a bad way. I say it in an inadequate way. You see, I just did that. I just did it myself. I said it in a bad way. No, I said it in an inadequate way. Why do I use the word inadequate? The word inadequate is more precise to what I wanted to say. It's not totally bad. It's inadequate. So I just showed you how a person comes to the assistance of their own words. That's exactly what a conversation is. It's people constantly coming to help their own words because they didn't say it right the first time. We naturally stammer in one way or another. We're all stutterers and stammerers, like Moshe Rabbeinu. A little bit more elaborately here, he says on page 96, thematization manifests the other because the proposition that posits and offers the world does not float in the air, but promises a response to him who receives this proposition, who directs himself towards the other, because in his proposition he receives the possibility of questioning. So a proposition is not something, he's talking here about philosophical propositions, right? A proposition in the sense of, what was that? A proposition in the sense of a statement, a philosophical statement. He says, even a philosophical statement, as we would like it to be like a Euclidean statement, the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square on the other two sides. I'm done saying what I wanted to say. There's nothing I have to say to elaborate that. So he says I can write it and I can put it in a book on the shelf and it's there for eternity and doesn't necessarily involve a living conversation. Levinas says that's not really how philosophical propositions work. Philosophical propositions are by nature conversational in a sense. So when I say something, when I write something in philosophy, I'm writing to someone. Someone's out there listening. The proposition has an other who waits for it. And by the same token, therefore, that person has a question. I can't just say something and expect people to go, oh, salima, yes, Your Highness, what you say is absolute. No, the whole point of saying anything in philosophy is so that a question, like Sam has right now, will be posed.
I'm just curious if the interactional framework here is influenced by Buber, or if that's coincidental. It seems to me like it's very, very similar to the basic structure of I, thou, and I, it.
I'm very glad you mentioned that. We will see that Levinas criticizes Buber, right? He's very critical of Buber. But the joke is, of course, that he has much more that he owes to Buber then he has to criticize in Buber. So yes, of course, he will say exactly how his concept of the other is not exactly what Buber would have us think under the category of the thou, the du. He wants to saying something that's fine. But Sam, you're absolutely right. That there's no question, and he acknowledges it too. He does even at one point he says it quite clearly. We'll see that Buber's definitely a major influence behind this book. His concept of the other would have been unthinkable without Buber's concept of the thou. And Rosenzweig, he mentions in the preface that he's very indebted to Rosenzweig, who was also indebted to Buber for the concept of thou. So absolutely, the thou is very, very important. So he says, just to jump to the end of this paragraph, he says that the presence of the interpretive key, and this is why I cite this here now before you can get into the book proper, the presence of the interpretative key in the sign to be interpreted is precisely the presence of the other in the proposition, the presence of him who can come to the assistance of his discourse, the teaching quality of all speech. Oral discourse is the plenitude of discourse. Line before that, the teaching quality of all speech. It's because I'm speaking to an other that I need to come to the assistance of my word. Well, maybe if I spoke to myself, I think I'm just wondering, Wordsworth, the great English poet, apparently would go out for long walks in the afternoon. He would walk his dog in the afternoon on these long walks, and he would take that opportunity to do Hesbodidus. He would talk out loud to himself, and he trained his dog to go farther ahead and to run back if he saw anyone, because he didn't want to be embarrassed being caught as some madman talking to himself. So monologue is definitely a possibility, a way of talking, and maybe even a healthy way of talking. And according to Breslov, is definitely advisable. Although actually there it's not monologue, you're talking to God, right? It's more like prayer. But definitely in dialogue is a type of speech in which I come to the assistance of my word. And the need for me to come to the assistance of my word is not so that I sound cool in my own head, because I'm always pretty satisfied with what I just said. I'm not satisfied with what you heard. That's the point of dissatisfaction. I may be happy with my sentence, but you're probably not. So that's why I need to come to help my sentence in order to clarify my proposition to you. And therefore, all speech is wrapped up in this constant assistance, coming to the assistance of my word. And therefore, and this is what I take from it, he doesn't say that here, but I take this as a directive for how to read texts. When you read a text, and we're going to read Levinas, you have to, at some point, you do, never mind, you have to. You always do. At some point when you read a book, you make one, and something will happen in your brain. Your brain will click, and will go one way or another direction. At some point in the reading, it could happen in the first sentence, it could happen in the first page, it could happen at the end of the book. It can happen in the author's next book. At some point in your brain, you will say to yourself, I like this book. So this is my kind of book. Or you will say, this book, it's well written, it's beautifully written, but this is not for me. That's how I feel about Heidegger, for example, right? Heidegger, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But bottom line, it's not somebody I want to have coffee with. If Heidegger came to the, want to have coffee? Nah, not really. I'll keep your book. If Nietzsche came to the door, Nietzsche, I'd travel across the world to have coffee with Nietzsche. Heidegger, not interested. Nah, but I'll read his book. Right? At some point, the reader makes these decisions in her mind. Do I like this author or do I not like this author? We either gravitate towards a text or we have an allergic reaction of some sort. There are different allergic reactions, right? Now at that point, as soon as you've made one of those two decisions, you also make a hermeneutic decision, a decision of how will I now approach the book? Because when I read a book, any book, not just a human book, by the way, but even, you know what my favorite book is? I don't know if you guys know this, but I'll tell you, the author of my favorite book is God. My favorite book is the Chumash, right? God wrote a really good book, which I really like. He's my favorite author. But I must admit, this is going to be on Facebook, a little scared here, but I must admit that when I read God's book, sometimes I go, I don't know about that. There are certain lines in God's book where I'm not so happy with those lines, right? And that's inevitable. How can you be happy with every sentence that you read? But because I, Michael Kegel, have made the hermeneutic decision that I love God's book, that God is my favorite writer, without question, without compare, God is my favorite writer, and I love this book. So that means that in my brain I have made the hermeneutic decision that whenever I read a line that I don't like, I will find a way to like it. I will look for a way to like it. I will look for a way to change my own mind. I will say, I don't like this, but this is my favorite author. I have to find a way to forgive this text. I have to come to peace with this text. I have to come, as he says, to the assistance of this text. And I think, by the way, I'm not alone in this, if I'm not wrong, all the perushim that we have on the Torah, in a sense, amount to that. What is a perush? We did a great course. We did a course with Lawi, right? On perushim, on interpretations of the Torah. Why are there interpretations of the Torah? Why can't God can't make himself clear? Apparently not. The maker of the cosmos can't make himself clear on paper? Apparently not. He needs human beings to come along and say, well, let me explain this. Let me come to the assistance of this text. Coming to the assistance of a text is what a perush is. All texts require perushim. By the way, if you don't like what I'm saying on this count, or Rashi says, you can read this. Walter Benjamin makes the same point. Walter Benjamin was one of the great literary critics of the 20th century, if not the greatest. And he says the same thing about literary criticism. He says a text that is not intimately bound up with the literary criticism of that text, in other words, with the commentary that comes to the aid of that text will not achieve what he calls Überlebung. It has Leben, it lives, but it will never survive. It will never live beyond itself. For a text to live beyond itself, it needs commentary. Now, of course, if you don't like the text, you will have the opposite reaction, which is that I'm not coming to the assistance of this text. In fact, I'm going to criticize it. That's what criticism in the negative sense of the word is. And if you think about it, if you think about the different types of texts, when you have read texts about texts, what's easier? In fact, when you write essays, when you write an essay for me, what is easier, to come to a text in a friendly way or an unfriendly way? I have an answer for that, what I think, but I'm curious, what do you think?
It depends what your goal is. I think if you're talking about it in the context of writing a paper, we talked about this over Yantif, but I think it's much easier to argue against it, because if you just agree you're ultimately summarizing, you might have like your own insight on why this is right, but ultimately there's much less to say because it's already been said.
Very good. So of course, criticism is much easier, which is, by the way, one of the most dominant forms of literacy today is Facebook. People do more writing on Facebook than in any other medium. And I've noticed that the dominant literary trope of Facebook is criticism. It's much easier to criticize somebody than it is to say something positive. Because if you say something positive, what are you doing? As you just said, Sam, are you summarizing? Are you just repeating what that person says? If you're going to say something positive and you want me to listen, it better be interesting. If it's going to be interesting, it can't be a repetition of what you just said. It has to be something new. It has to be the same thing you just said. It has to be new. It has to be assistance. I have to come to the assistance of what you just said and improved on what you just said. That's not easy. That's hard. It's much easier to say, that idea. Do you know what Plato thinks? He thinks is it's so infantile, right? It's so infantile. It's so childish to say that. And people make a career out of being critics. Why? Because it's very easy, relatively. If you're smart, if you have a modicum of intelligence, It's not hard to be critical because the world is full of flaws. Humans are full of flaws. Everything people say is full of flaws. It's so easy to find flaws. A child with a bit of a brain can find flaws right away. It's not so easy to come to the assistance of a flaw. That's not easy. To be a commentator, a parshan, that's not so easy. Because you have to say, because first of all, you have to be a critic. You have to say, you know what? There's a flaw here. Let's be honest. There is a flaw. I'm not going to apologize for the text because there's a flaw. But now, given the flaw, and now I have to start working and seeing, well, given the flaw, number one, and given the fact that I'm in love with this author, what am I going to do? I have to express my love for the author by coming to the aid of this text and covering up the flaws in this text to the extent that I can. That's parshanut. That's somebody who loves the author. So this is my approach to this text, definitely. I'm critical of other texts. Don't get me wrong. I don't think all texts are worthy of my assistance. Everybody has texts they like and texts they don't like. So, when I read Heidegger, I'm not that friendly towards Heidegger. When I read Levinas, I'm very friendly. That's unfair. Yeah, it definitely is unfair. I would never apologize for that. You have to own your own intellect. You own your own personality as a reader to be able to say honestly which are the texts that I like and which are the texts that I don't like. Who are the authors I identify with and who are the authors that I don't? Even though I may identify with an author to some extent, on the whole I don't, or vice versa. Okay, let's get into this text now. Let's get into this amazing text. You know what? Playing here with this so our Facebook buddies can see it. I can do this. Okay, yeah, that's actually up there. Okay. It's going to blind. No, it's not going to look so good. Okay. We'll do a little bit of the preface today. I think this preface was written after the book. I'm not sure. You never know what preface is, but my feeling, just a feeling, maybe somebody knows for a fact, but my feeling is that this preface is written afterwards. The first line, it's worth dwelling on. Everyone will readily agree that it is of the highest importance to know whether we are not duped by morality. Every philosopher, there's a book for philosophers here, right? Everyone agrees that it's very, very important that when we're talking about morality, we should know whether we're being duped. You know what duped means, yeah? Tricked. So he's telling you right in the first sentence what this book is about. This book is about morality. This whole book is going to be about ethics or morality. Two words, basically synonymous. One is a Greek root, one is a Latin root, but in effect, they are completely synonymous in Levinas's vocabulary. He's telling you, we're going to talk about morality. And you know what? Our first question when we come to morality, very often people come to morality, for example, if you read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, so he'll have other questions there. What is the good? What is truly the best thing in life? And Aristotle will say, well, it's happiness. Well, what is happiness? And so on. Immanuel Kant, when he's doing the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, what exactly is ethics? Oh, it's not happiness, but it's what he calls the ought, sollen, the categorical imperative. Levinas asks a much, much more fundamental question. He says, wait a minute, ethics? Are you sure there is even such a thing? Are you sure there's ethics? Is anything ethical? Is that maybe just a human way of behaving? I mean, when you watch National Geographic and you see a lion jumping on a gazelle or a zebra, or if your cat brings you back a little mouse, once I had a cat who came back in the house with half a mouse sticking out of her mouth. It's warm now, yeah? Or what should we do? Well, let's continue a little more and then maybe wait. What do you think?
Tomorrow we can eat.
Okay. Did she warm it?
Yes, it's already warm.
Well, maybe maybe at the end of class if anyone wants.
But if you have a class tomorrow, did you order food for tomorrow? If not, probably it's better to save it for tomorrow.
Oh, we have, I think, for today and tomorrow. We have enough food for both days.
Anyone wants to eat?
I'll eat at the end of class. I'll have my portion at the end.
Hogyha lehet, akkor ennél meg. A többieknek nem tudjuk mit csinálni.
Okay. Köszönöm szépen. Yeah. What was I saying? Oh yeah, National Geographic. So when you see, I had my cat and mouse story. So I once had a cat who came back to me with half a mouse sticking out of her mouth. And there's a temptation to think, oh, bad cat, bad cat. But that's not a bad cat. Imagine a cat saying to another cat, bad cat. That's ridiculous. Cats catch mice. That's what we do. We're going to eat a nice beef meal afterwards, right? There's nothing. That's our animal self. Nothing particularly moral about that. I mean, you might have, when you watch a tiger or a lion eating a gazelle, it might make you a little bit sick in the first moments, the way they jump on and start eating it while it's still alive. But it's not immoral for an animal to do that. And therefore, if it's not immoral for a lion to do that, why should it be immoral for me? I'm an animal. If I want to eat another human being for lunch, if I'm feeling Hannibalish, Lecterish, and I feel like eating a human being for lunch, I'm an animal. I also deserve to be on National Geographic. Why can't I eat? He said, well, that's immoral. Well, what is morality? Why should morality be anything? Maybe morality is just something that human beings concocted, as a result of all kinds of social contracts and what Nietzsche would call herd instinct, and it's some kind of civilizational product of human history, but not necessarily something valid in and of itself, such that a human life has intrinsic worth, and killing a human being is murder, and the killer deserves to be murdered, not to be murdered, but to be executed according to some moral schemes. So the first question Levinas is are we duped by morality? Is it a trick that we're playing on ourselves? And here he brings in, and we mentioned this in our discussion of the biography, he brings in the biggest proof to suggest for why morality is in fact a complete illusion. The proof is war. Does not lucidity, the mind's openness to the true, consist in catching sight of the permanent possibility of war? The state of war suspends morality. It divests the eternal institutions and obligations of their eternity and rescinds ad interim the unconditional imperatives. In advance, it shows its shadow falls over. In advance, its shadow falls over the actions of men. War is not only one of the ordeals, the greatest, of which morality lives. It renders morality derisory. It renders morality laughable. When we, in happy Budapest of today, when we chas v'sholom hear about somebody being killed or somebody dying, we're horrified. Oh my gosh, how could it happen? It's newsworthy. Let's put it on the news. Let's lament it, whatever. But in Budapest of 1944, not here maybe because this is no longer the Jewish ghetto, but if you were, a couple hundred meters in that direction, a human being dying on the street, it's not a tragedy. It's not newsworthy. There's nothing really to talk about. It's kind of annoying because you have to walk over the dead body, but there's nothing particularly catastrophic about it. I don't know if you ever seen the movie The Pianist. It takes place in the Warsaw Ghetto. Yeah, of course, Brigitte, you saw The Pianist, of course. It's not my favorite Holocaust film. It was a favorite Holocaust, a horrible expression, but there's something about the movie that disturbs me. I won't get into it now, but I must say there's one thing about that movie that really made a deep impression on me that I never saw in any other movie. There's a couple of scenes where the protagonist is walking through the Warsaw Ghetto, and there's just cadavers lying on the street, on the sidewalk, on the street, fully dressed in clothing, and he's walking and he has to step over a cadaver. You know, to me it was shocking because it wasn't Auschwitz. I've seen Auschwitz movies where people are in Auschwitz uniforms and they're, you know, the Muslimena, the emaciated, and they're, you know, they look horrible, right? So that's like the status quo. But here you have a street. It's Warsaw, and there's dead babies and children and adults on the street fully clothed, and people are walking over them like it's a rock or a pile of poo or something. You know, they're not really. It's not really. It's just an annoyance. It's not really a human being, right? How do we get to that state of mind? And we would all get there. There's no question. Under those circumstances, you have to be an extraordinary person to go, oh, there's a dead body here, right? You have to be like, wow, what are you, a tzaddik? You must be a tzaddik. You're horrified by a dead body. An average person is not horrified. They become inured. They become immune to that. That's what war does. That's what war conditions do. There's death left and right. And under those conditions, if you say to somebody, you know, that's not immoral, you say, what do you mean? What does that even mean, immoral? What are you talking about? What is moral? It's war, he says, renders morality derisory, laughable. It's worthy of derision. Yeah.
I just wish to say that I heard stories not so far that people went a couple of years ago to India, and it was the same situation. Almost the people, it's also from the hunger mix, not just the war. Mostly I think hunger is Peru. People, when the first Chabad people, they also told stories that children
dying on the street. It happens all the time. It's happening right now.
What? There, the body was the whole day.
Was decaying on the street, right? I remember once in Israel, I saw a dog decaying on the street. And I was horrified, you know, a dog in plain daylight on the street, rotting away and stinking and bloating. It was, ugh. And you know, and I can't even imagine a human being. But I'm sure that under the circumstances, you become insensitive. Now, Levinas is saying, okay, the war lasted, you know, 1939, 1945. A huge percentage of Europe experienced this and was destroyed, and the other percentage, which was not destroyed, lived with this. So he's talking from that perspective. But Levinas is a sensitive fellow, and sensitive people don't get over these things so easily. Some people, they go through the war. Many people. I've met people in Budapest here actually who was it recently? Yes, I actually met him in Vienna. I met a man in Vienna 2 Shabbases ago who was born in Budapest, lived through the ghetto in Budapest, and his father died in a concentration camp. His mother took him to Vienna. He grew up in Vienna. He says, my mother never spoke about the war and therefore about my childhood. She never mentioned his childhood. He has no memory of his childhood because he never talked about it. To her dying day, they never talked about his childhood. Right? It broke my heart to think of this man. And I understand it. This is a woman who was so deeply traumatized by what happened that she's like, nah, there's nothing to talk about. That's a pretty normal way to react to total trauma. Right? Now, Levinas says, on the contrary, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to talk about. In fact, you know, in fact, we should. Well, the first thing we should talk about, which is what he's talking about here, is rule number 1. Don't think that we're beyond that. Don't think that we've left that. Don't think that you can just push it aside, put it in the cupboards, put it away, put it in the bookshelves. You know, it's not gone just because it's true. We're no longer killing each other in the streets. That's true, Baruch Hashem. But don't think that the fact that that's possible is now in the past and something that we don't need to deal with. He says, on the contrary, that's always with us. We are always in Auschwitz. If Auschwitz happened, we're still there. On some level, we might have a great lunch, we might be enjoying ourselves, but on some level in our consciousness, we're still in Auschwitz. We're still in the Budapest ghetto. On some level, and and the only way we can deal with reality properly and fully and honestly is if we start by acknowledging that, and ask ourselves the question: Did the Budapest ghetto and did the Second World War undermine the validity of ethics and morality or not? And when I'm upset that somebody dies, is that a valid concern? Or, after all, if I was in Auschwitz, I wouldn't give a hell. So, don't make such a big deal about it now. Because I wouldn't back then, so why should I do it now? Yeah.
How does he deal with really two concepts? The first that comes to mind is Nuremberg, frankly. After the war was over, obviously not everyone responsible was punished as they should have been, but there was a generalized consensus among the nations of the world that what had happened was immoral, despite it having happened. Maybe people in the act didn't think so, but the events are brought to a conclusion in some way by an agreement on their immorality. And second, there's the concept of we have a concept of war crimes, which would suggest that at the very least there's some idea that it's okay to kill people in the right certain circumstances, but not necessarily in others.
Yeah, okay. I can see why you're asking the questions together. They work well together. Let's just deal with the first one first. People could say, and I'm even tempted to say, actually, Trial at Nuremberg, is one of my favorite movies, actually. My wife and I agree on that. Spencer Tracy and Trial at Nuremberg. We're talking about, of course, about the trial that the Allies did in Nuremberg in 1945 and so on. Not, because the beautiful irony of Nuremberg is that Nuremberg was also the place where the Nazis instituted the Nuremberg laws, which were anti-Semitic and so on. So it was in keeping with that logic, it was for ironic purposes that the Americans, French, and so on put the Nazis on trial in Nuremberg. I think a perfectly honest thinker might say, and I would be very tempted to agree with him, that what Trial at Nuremberg is? Trial at Nuremberg is the winners putting the losers on trial. That's what we do. That's what everybody does. When we win something, if the Nazis had won the Second World War, they'd be putting any other Jew and any other, not Jews, the Jews would be all dead, but any Jew lover would be on trial, just as they were during the first Nuremberg trials. I mean, the trials that are discussed in the trials in Nuremberg. If you remember, what's her name, Dorothy from Wizard of Oz. What's the actress's name? Eliza Minnelli. Right? Her case. The Eliza Minnelli case is that she was in Nuremberg. She was tried for having sympathy towards a Jew. Right? So if the Nazis won the war, the Judeophiles would be on trial. The Americans and the French and the Russians won the war, so we put the Germans on trial just because we won, just because we can afford to. That's it. Bottom line. A good Nietzschean answer. Right? What is morality? Morality is what the winners say morality is. Now, I think that's a very strong argument. How can you deny that argument? How can you say, well, no, they were fair? How do you know they were fair? Have you ever really seriously considered what the Nazis wanted? Have you ever thought about the inner truth of Nazism? I know it sounds weird for Jews to say that, but Nazis were not stupid. Heidegger wasn't stupid. Germans are not stupid. These are people who thought about they had a Weltanschauung, they had a way of looking at reality, which was in keeping with Charles Darwin's view of the world. This is not some cockamamie system of society and politics. This is political Darwinism. It's rooted in the truth of Darwinism. And if Darwin says that the unfit is better off dead, let's speed that along, right? And if people disagree with us, that just shows how pathetic and weak they are, these Jews. Jews are people who champion the weak and the pathetic and the cripples of the world, the demented of the world. And we should kill the Jews because they are the champions of that. That's why they deserve to die, right? Jews believe in weakness, says Nietzsche. Right? You might not like that attitude. I don't like it because I'm a Jew, but I see the logic of it. There's a logic to it, right? So if we say, well, Nuremberg, we showed that logic wrong. No, we didn't. We didn't show anything wrong about that logic. All we did is we took an ancient logic, which that disagreed with that, which came from the French Revolution, which is the logic of humanism, which is rooted partly in the Bible, partly in Aristotle and in Plato and in Socrates, and which believes in ethics. And we championed that, and we criticized German war criminals, under that category. You could make that argument. Why am I giving the Nazis such a good picture here? Because putting them in a good light, because that's what Levinas is trying to do, believe it or not. He's saying, look, let's take this problem seriously. Is morality real or not? Do we actually have an argument against Nazis or not? It's not clear. You can't just say, well, yeah, of course we do. We're European. We're good Europeans. Well, you know what? Good Europeans, you didn't behave so well. Last couple of years, says Levinas, 1945. If you're such good people, such civilized, Americans are the same as Europeans. But when I say European, America's just a colony of Europe. It's just an American. It's a European colony. It's a very big one, but it's an American. It's a European colony, right? So these very, very civilized people, we're not these dirty, disgusting these cannibal Africans, right? We're European. We're sophisticated. We listen to Mozart and Beethoven, and we go to the art gallery. We have, Georg Faludi. No, he's after. Never mind. We have great writers, right? In Hungarian, in German, and French, right? We would never behave like savages. Oh yeah. Well, you know what? The Second World War proved that you could be much, much worse than savages. Savages are nothing compared to Europeans. Europeans have shown themselves to be the most vicious, the most cannibalistic human beings in history with the Second World War. So Levinas says, well, now let's look at that. That's interesting. Can we make a claim for morality given that background? The war? You see now why I wanted to emphasize in my biographical introduction that when he says that living in the presentiment and the memory of Auschwitz it's not an influence. This is what ethics comes out of. It comes out of that reality. It comes out of a total philosophical trauma added to the personal trauma of what to do with the Second World War. I don't really think we're over it. Even today, we're not really over that trauma, even though it's been so long.
It seems to me like you can just a counter response would be all you've proven is that morality doesn't exist might not exist for Europeans. Then, the only reason we agree upon a united humanity in the first place is some idea of humanistic impulse.
Of course, there is Rwanda, which is a Holocaust, Cambodia, which is a Holocaust, which has very little to do with Europe. Not to mention the sacrifices, the human sacrifice to the god Mach, of the Aztecs, and human history is full of blood. I mean, I'm emphasizing Europe just because that's the immediate context, and it's the most hypocritical context. Europeans are merely the biggest hypocrites when they champion morality. I don't know if the ancient Aztecs would have ever cared to champion. Obviously, they wouldn't have because they had human sacrifice. But Europeans say, no, we're moral. And Levinas says, really? You're moral? Let's look at this. What is morality? It seems to me you don't have a hold on morality. It seems to me we need to go back to class with morality, which is why Levinas writes this book. Right? Totality and Infinity is not just a philosophical work. It's a work of somebody who's like a prophet. Levinas is not a prophet. But a prophet is somebody who writes a book under a compulsion. The book of Isaiah is not just a book. It's not like a novel. It's not like, I'll write the Iliad, because it'll be fun. Or maybe for Homer it's also a compulsion. But definitely for Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is a compulsion. I need to write it because if not, Chas v'chalila, Rahman al-Atzlan, what would the world be with the book of Isaiah? The world might not exist without the book of Isaiah. Without the book of Isaiah, the world might have collapsed under itself. So Levinas, in a sense, is doing a philosophical version of that. He's saying, look, what just happened to us in the Second World War? We need to deal with that, my friends. Right? And this is Levinas's fame is, thank God, predicated upon that. People agreed with him. They said, you know what, you're right. Until then, people were taken with Heidegger and other thinkers who were asking questions in metaphysics and the critique of metaphysics and epistemology and in a philosophy of language, psychology and things like that, Levinas said, hey guys, what about ethics? You remember ethics? Ethics wasn't popular at that time in the 50s, 40s, 60s, right? Levinas, in a sense, brought it back into vogue. Maybe because people were so traumatized that they became paralyzed by the problem of ethics. They didn't know what to do with the problem. So Levinas says, okay, I have a suggestion here. Happens to be a very old suggestion, a Jewish one, and I'm going to translate it into philosophical language. Okay, let's read the second paragraph here. He says, we do not need obscure fragments from Heraclitus to prove that being reveals itself as war to philosophical thought. That war does not only affect it as the most patent fact, but as the very patency, the truth of the real. The allusion to Heraclitus is that Heraclitus says, among his many cryptic aphorisms, Heraclitus says that the god of everything is polemos, is war, the god of all reality. What Heraclitus meant by that is not necessarily anything like the Second World War or even the Trojan War, but that reality is in constant conflict. And Levinas is saying here, we don't need Heraclitus to tell us that war is the father of everything. He says it's not only it's the most patent fact, the most obvious fact, but more than that, it is patency. Not just the most patent fact. It is not just the most obvious fact. It is obviousness itself. It's the truth of the real. War is truth. In war, we discover who we truly, truly are. In war, reality rends the words and images that dissimulate it, to obtrude in its nudity and in all its harshness. Harsh reality. This sounds like a pleonasm. In other words, like a pleonasm is a redundancy of words, an unnecessary. In other words, he's saying that harsh reality is a redundancy. Reality is intrinsically harsh. That's what reality is. It's harshness. Harsh object lesson at the very moment of its fulguration. Fulguration means the flaming forth, like thunder and lightning. At the very moment of its fulguration, when the drapings of illusion burn war, is produced as the pure experience of pure being. Crazy, huh? Nobody until Levinas could have said something like this. The experience of pure being. You have to imagine yourself in the philosophical circles. People are reading Heidegger, where all they talk about is Sein und the Sein und das Sein, der being and ontology, being and this and being that. And Levinas says, you know what pure being is? The experience of pure being. It's not sitting out in the forest, communing with God and nature. It's not looking up at the stars. It's not looking into yourself and uniting Atman and Brahman. Pure being is war. That's what pure being is. Pure being is being in Auschwitz. Pure being is being in a trench somewhere on the Western Front. That's pure being. Pure being, the experience of pure being. Harshness, the ontological event that takes form in this black light. Reminds me of an image by Julia Kristeva. The black light, poetic image, right? Ontological event that takes form in this black light of war is a casting into movement of beings hitherto anchored in their identity, a mobilization of absolutes by an objective order from which there is no escape. Until war breaks out, people are locked emotionally, privately, personally in their own identities, in their subjectivities, in their little corner of the world. I see the world from my little corner. As soon as war breaks out, there is no more my little corner. Think of Elie Wiesel, the way he talks about Seagate. For Elie Wiesel, everything was Seagate. That was his little corner of the world. It was it had its little problems and its quirks or whatever, but that's where he communed with God, and that's where he found Kabbalah, and everything that was beautiful was in Seagate. Suddenly, he's deported to Auschwitz, and his little world becomes very, very big. In Auschwitz, the little boy from Seagate suddenly comes face to face with the real. Welcome to the desert of the real, right? This is the desert of the real. In Auschwitz, one confronts the objectivity itself. You no longer have the private, subjective world of the little village that you came from. You come to terms with what is real, and that is war. The trial by force is the test of the real. But violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments, but their own substance, making them carry out actions that will destroy every possibility of action. Thinking, since I have Wiesel in mind, you guys have read Night, yeah? For me, one of the most horrifying episodes of Night, Wiesel describes how during one of the marches there was he's with his own father, and with them there was another father and son, and somebody throws a piece of bread into them, and they haven't eaten for days, right? And everybody jumps on the bread. The son jumps on the bread, or the father. I don't remember. I'm sorry if I'm misremembering the details. The father jumps on the bread, and the son rips the bread out of the father's hand, and the father says, "My son, I was going to share this bread with you, my son. What are you doing?" And the son beats up his father, right? It's a horrific moment, right? Because a son is ripping bread out of his own father's hands, stealing from his own father, right? And the father, in that moment, the father's like, reality has just fallen apart. What is real over here? My own son is taking food from my own mouth, right? This is what he's talking about here, making them betray not only commitments, making every individual betray not only commitments, but their own substance. When a son betrays his father so viciously, he's not betraying a commitment to the commandment in the Decalogue, kibud av aim, honor your father and your mother. He goes, oh well, that's really inappropriate. You just failed to keep the commandment of honoring your father. That's not what he's doing. He's betraying his own substance. Even bad sons don't do that. Even bad sons don't steal food from their father. You have to be a really bad son. You have to be a psychotic son to do such a thing. But in Auschwitz, everyone is psychotic. How can you not be psychotic in Auschwitz? So that's what you do. And therefore, Auschwitz undermines the possibility. Auschwitz is not just something terrible that happened. That's not enough to say that Auschwitz is something terrible. Of course it was terrible. Auschwitz is something that undermines the possibility of reality as we know it. It pulls the carpet out from under our feet and says, you think this is what humanity is? Think again. If you think humanity is basically good, basically nice, think again. Watch an Auschwitz movie and then tell me about it. Tell me what you think now about humanity. Baruch Hashem, it hasn't happened since then, but does anyone honestly believe that it won't happen, or that it can't happen again? It won't happen, God willing, it won't happen again, but that it can't happen again? We know it. We know it can happen again. Of course it can. Why not? Why not? It's human, it's a given. It's a human given. This is the terrible petri dish. This is the terrible medium in which Levinas has to develop his theory of ethics. He says, we're going to talk about ethics, but let's be very, very real here. If we're going to talk about ethics, let's talk about what humanity really is in its most raw and most violent form. And let's see if we find anything like ethics within this truth. Because if we don't, we're not really doing ethics. We're doing social work. We're doing, we're doing politics. Actually, he even says that at the end of this paragraph. It says, war establishes an order from which no one can keep his distance. Nothing henceforth is exterior. War does not manifest exteriority and the other as other. It destroys the identity of the same. Sorry, I thought it was... I just jumped out. Okay, no, it must be on the next page. Sorry. The next page where where he talks about politics as being, okay, I don't have it in front of me, but we'll come to it. He talks about politics being as, politics is the other face of war. It's true that von Clausewitz has that famous phrase, that, was it Samuel, remember it?
War is the continuation of politics by other means.
Thank you. Yeah, I think he says diplomacy, I think, in that thing, but that's exactly politics, right? War is politics, it's just politics that's, a little dirtier. It's a little more violent. It's politics with the gauntlet down, or the gauntlet on, actually. War and politics are basically two sides of the same coin. It's just that one of them is nicer. Politics is nicer. And war is not so nice. But they're basically the same. So Levinas says, when we're talking about ethics, we're definitely not talking about politics. Politics is not adequate. A political analysis of human reality is not adequate to produce an ethics. Which is why, for example, somebody like Rousseau, I'm sure you've heard of Rousseau, and social contract. The idea of Rousseau that why are people nice to each other? Well, because we come to an agreement. We really would like to kill each other. This is more Hobbes, maybe. We really would love to kill each other, but, it's so messy and problematic, and it's very difficult. If we all start, if you have the Wild West here, it's going to be very messy. So let's have a social contract. I promise I won't kill you if you promise you don't kill me. I promise I won't steal from you if you promise you don't steal from me. And there we go. We have ethics, right? So Levinas would say that's not ethics. That's politics. That's politics on a personal level. That's two people coming to a mutual, an agreement of mutual benefit. It's mutually beneficial. It's not ethics, right? Because as soon as war hits, that social contract has gone into the garbage. It's null and void. So if anything that disappears so quickly cannot be ethics. For Levinas, ethics must be visible in Auschwitz. When a person in Auschwitz did an ethical thing, and people did do ethical things in Auschwitz. It happened. I think Elie Wiesel says, no, it wasn't. It was Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, in his Man in Search of Meaning, he says, those of us who survived know that the best of us did not survive. The best human beings in Auschwitz, they all died because they were the best. Somebody who's good can't survive that. To survive Auschwitz, you have to be a little bit of an asshole. You have to be able to bring that out. You have to bring out that energy, right? To survive, you have to be an animal. But that means that there were people in Auschwitz who were capable of being ethical in Levinas' sense. Right? They manifested ethics. We'll see what that is. Questions? No? Okay, page 22 here now. I'm jumping to page 22, second paragraph. Let's see. Yeah, the moral consciousness. The moral consciousness. The moral consciousness can sustain the mocking gaze of the political. Here we go. Political, thank you. The moral consciousness can sustain the mocking gaze of the political man, only if, here we go, now we're getting to it. Only if the certitude of peace dominates the evidence of war. Right? A moral human being can stand the mocking gaze of the political. In other words, anyone who believes that the political and the ethical are basically the same, or rather that the ethical can be reduced to the political, such a person is naturally a cynic. They'll engage in politics, but like von Clausewitz, they'll say, well, you know what? Diplomacy will not achieve the ends now, so we've got to do it the hard way, right? That's the political human being. And when a political human being sees a tzaddik, sees a person who's ethical, so they can't help but suppress a laugh. For them, it's a little bit funny. Somebody who's a saint is a bit of an idiot. Oh, like Dostoevsky's idiot, right? He's a Dostoevskian idiot, but an idiot in every sense of the word. It's laughable. So he says a person who is Dostoevsky's idiot, a person who is an ethical human being, how can he withstand the gaze, the mocking gaze of the very political human being, of Hobbes or somebody like that? He says only in one way. If the certitude of peace dominates the evidence of war. Now, here we're getting into some very heady stuff, right? The certitude of peace dominates the evidence of war. Well, if war is on the side of evidence, and evidence, generally speaking, is how intelligent people like to establish something as true and as certain, not just true, but as certain, right? How do you know that happened? Well, we have evidence. Oh, you have evidence? Oh, that must have happened. We have 2 witnesses, or we have forensic evidence. We had a CSI unit, went out, checked things out. We're pretty certain that happened. So we have the evidence is in there, so we're pretty certain. Well, if Levinas says, well, the evidence of peace stands in contrast, in conflict with the certitude of war. War establishes the general conditions of certitude, of evidence. However, there's such a thing as a certitude of peace, which of course will have to be a certainty which is not evidential, which cannot be based on evidence. How could it be? War has monopolized evidence. So how could you be certain if you don't have any evidence? Are you just being subjective? You know, I'm certain people are good deep down inside, right? Well, you know, nice to think that, but surely the certitude of war proves otherwise. You know, surely you're just being an idiot, in Dostoevsky's sense, right? But Levinas says, well, no, actually, you know what? I think we can say something about the certitude of peace. Such a certitude is not obtained by a simple play of antitheses. It's not simply by saying peace is the opposite of war. We're going to have to find the certitude of peace from within war, not simply by contrasting it to war. The peace of empires issued from war rests on war. Here we have it, von Clausewitz, right there, right? How do we have peace? Well, we have a treatise. We get together at Geneva and we decide we're not going to kill each other anymore. In other words, we've established a social contract based on war, that we're not going to fight wars again, but that is completely predicated on war. In other words, our peace is a truce. It's like in Israel, when you hear, okay, that we're no longer firing rockets on the Palestinians because they've decided to no longer launch balloons in our direction. So it's a truce. Well, a truce is really war. It's still war. It's just a quiet war, right? And political peace, which is a truce, is really just a quiet war. That's not ethics. It does not restore to the alienated beings their lost identity. If we're going to come out of Auschwitz and to regain our identity, we need much more than a truce. We need much more than the Nuremberg trials, which say that, you naughty, naughty boys, that was really not nice what you did in Auschwitz, and now you're going to pay for it. That's just not enough. We need more than the Nuremberg trials. Beautiful, eloquent, edifying speech by Spencer Tracy, no matter how beautiful, about humanity and about humanism, is not enough. It's good for making somebody who likes baseball and apple pie feel good about themselves, but it's not enough for ethics. For that, a primordial and original relation to being is required. We need a primordial and original relation. In other words, if the evidence of war is going to give us a primordial relation to reality, we need an equally primordial. You know what primordial means, right, guys? Like original, like in a sense, like primordial is a word that we use of Maseh Breshit. The universe is created, it's primordial, right? We need something very original, something very, very basic when we're talking about morality. Morality will oppose politics in history and will have gone beyond the functions of prudence or the canons of the beautiful to proclaim itself unconditional and universal when the eschatology of messianic peace will have come to superpose itself on the ontology of war. We should probably spend the rest of this class on this one sentence, right? There's so many words here that need to be explained, and really this one sentence kind of packs. This whole preface is really packed into this one sentence, right? We have to work backwards, okay? War. Last word is war. Let's read backwards. Of war. What of war? Ontology of war. War, what is ontology? Guys know? Anybody know what ontology is? Fancy, schmancy Greek word.
Isn't it events or study of events?
Oh, Heidegger would have loved your answer. It's ontos in Greek. It means being. It's a declension of being. So why Heidegger? Because Heidegger had this word event, which he later used to explain ontology, Ereignis. But ontology of war, ontology is the study of being. It's the most abstract possible discussion you can ever have. What is. What is, right? When we talk, philosophers talk about all kinds of things. When they come to the word, what is that? What is this? What is that? That's a basic philosophical question, as Socrates, as Aristotle taught us, right? TST. What is that? What's that? And we try to define what that is. And then at one point, philosophers go, wait a minute, what is? When you say what is, now you're asking the question of ontology. And that was Heidegger's question, right? So as we saw, Levinas, who associates, Heidegger is associated with Germany, obviously, Germany of the Second World War. And Germany, in a sense, is the political enterprise that acts out what Heidegger would have called ontology, where ontology is the study of what is of being, which, as I mentioned earlier, is connected to paganism and so on. But here, basically, what Levinas is saying is that war tells us what is the case. This is the case. This is reality. This is the real. We have the ontology of war. Now, something will have come to superpose itself upon the ontology of war. Something has to oppose the ontology of war if ethics is going to be real. What is that thing which is going to oppose the ontology of war? He calls it the eschatology of messianic peace. Now, what is eschatology? Another $6 million words. 68 was it? Whatever, it's millions of dollars. What is the eschatology of messianic peace? What is eschatology, rather? Sorry. Messianic peace, peace, messianic, Mashiach. Eschatology, the Greek word eschaton means the end. The yamim achronim, the end of days. So the eschaton is the end of time. The eschatology is it's a Christian word to describe what will happen in the end of days, when in Christianity there's the resurrection of Jesus. But Jews use the word as well to describe messianic days, the Messiah. Messianic days are called the final days, the end days, and that's eschatology. So the eschatology, now again, we're reading backwards here. When the eschatology of peace, of messianic peace, imposes itself upon the hard evidence, the ontology of war, that is when ethics will have shown its truth. What do you think he's saying here before I go on? I've been droning on.
The only way to prove morality exists is to eradicate immorality, if I'm following this correctly. Or to eradicate the thing, I don't know how to put it, not just immorality, but like a fundamental immorality that's so deep that it challenges the very existence of morality.
You're absolutely right when it comes to the performative side of what he's saying. In other words, the commandment, the normative side of what he's saying. Obviously, Levinas wants to engender an attitude towards life where we have the strength, the wherewithal, emotionally, more important, philosophically, to stand up against immorality by being moral, right? That's what he wants. But in order to do that, in order to have that wherewithal, we need to have some type of ability to see the good, to see what is good as opposed to what is bad. Now, that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about some type of understanding. There's an understanding at stake. Remember, he juxtaposes the certitude of morality to the evidence of war, which means that he's saying that there's two types of understanding. There's an understanding of war which has evidence, and that understanding needs to be confronted militarily, as it were, by a certitude, which will engender morality. But where does that certitude come from? You can't say it comes from morality because that's circular. We have to say what is it that allows us to be moral, given the hard evidence of war? You see what I'm saying, Sam? Mm-hmm. So my question now is, just to repeat my question, what does that have to do with what I just said with eschatology? Feel free to say anything and then come to the assistance of your word. Remember, we have to, in philosophy, we always have to assume that the first thing that we say is wrong. It's probably wrong, the first thing you say. The second thing you say might be more right. So don't be afraid to say things wrong. Yeah.
Well, I mean, my obvious thought was God, but I'm almost kind of reminded of one of Descartes' proofs for the existence of God, where he says people can't conceive of something greater than themselves. And basically, I don't know how to put it. The idea that we can conceive of an ability to move past that or seems to be significant to him somehow. But I haven't pieced it together yet.
So we're going to get to it, but he has a great reading of Descartes, by the way, which we'll get to, I hope, at some point, which is connected to this. But remember, I want you to be sensitive. Again, I know this is a very difficult text, especially English is not your first language, so your English is great. But I'm just saying your feel for the language is going to be off for this, and he's so unnecessarily obscure in French. So the sentence is full of big words, and it's not like, what the hell is he trying to say here, right? All these big words. The unconditional universal and the eschatology of messianic peace will have come to superimpose itself on the ontology of war. Come on, give me a break, Levinas. Just say it in some plain words, right? But our job here is to break down these words, to understand what he's actually saying with his words. He wants to superimpose the eschatology of messianic peace on the ontology of war, right? He's telling us that eschatology, let's keep it simple. Let's say eschatology is opposed to war. How? How is the reality of war refuted? Opposed, at least, not refuted yet. We haven't refuted anything yet, but opposed by eschatology. Remember, eschatology here would be a claim on truth. He wants us to have a truth that is strong enough to be able to fight war. It's funny. He wants us to have a strong enough moral sensitivity that we'll be able to resist war. Think of yourself as Gandhi, right? Fighting in that sense. Ahimsa. You want to be Gandhi. You want to be able to confront war, not by fighting, but with non-violence. You want to say, I will have no part in war. Well, I'm going to punch you in the face. If you have to punch me in the face, you punch me in the face. If that's what it takes, okay. Why? Because I am coming to the table not with a sword and gun. I'm not saying this is the right way. I'm not a big Gandhi fan, but I'm trying to think in terms of Gandhi to make sense of what eschatology means here, right? He's saying that in order to confront the harsh, ugly reality of war, which undermines morality, I need to come with eschatology. How is eschatology going to empower me here? How is the Messiah, how's Mashiach going to empower me to confront this? No ideas? And it's almost 2 o'clock and we're going to break soon. Our brains are melting. Yeah.
Well, so it seems to me, at the beginning he talked about the permanent possibility of war being actually in a way that suggests that the possibility of war is actually worse than the war itself as a problem for morality. And eschatology presupposes that things aren't changing from there on out. So the permanent possibility of war, in theory, doesn't have to continue being.
Nice. You mean it's not permanent anymore because it comes to an end. Nice. That's a very nice, simple, that encapsulates it very nicely. Right, so eschaton, which means the end, is the end of war. So if there's a permanent possibility of war, then if we have some intellectual and spiritual ability to tap into the truth of an eschaton, to be able to say, this will come to an end, gam ze ya'avor, right? Everything will come to an end. Then we have the possibility of undermining the permanence of war. We're not going to get to it today because it's already 2 o'clock, but we're going to see how he develops what he calls, he uses the word optics, which is a very Jewish word, especially if we translate it, well, he used the word vision also. If we translate it as chazon, a vision of Yechezkel or Isaiah, that there's such a thing as seeing reality, that even though all the evidence is mobilized against this vision, all the evidence says otherwise, nevertheless, this power of seeing is so powerful that it can completely belie the evidence. It could say, I know I'm in hell, I know I'm in Auschwitz, but this too shall pass. And therefore, and I may not survive, but because this too shall pass shows that human beings are not meant to be in Auschwitz all the time. There is such a thing as behaving decently. There is an end to things. And of course, we'll have to get into how is this vision of an end, the end of Auschwitz, which happens within time, in 1945, is connected to an even greater end, which is the eschaton of history itself, where, as our prophet says, that the swords shall be beaten into plowshares, that peace will vanquish all war. All war will become obsolete in the end of time. That the end of war is predicated upon a certain power of vision, a certain insight, which is eschatological in nature. But we'll get back to this tomorrow. Thoughts, questions? It's a hard text, right?
I assume he addresses this, but my immediate question is, but what if we're just wrong? Like eschatology, we have a vision of the end of days that presupposes that war doesn't have to, is not a permanent possibility. What if we're incorrect?
Well, you see, that question is basically impossible to answer, I would say. It's that question, you're asking a very powerful question. At the end of the day, this is not Levinas saying, I'm not sure what he would say, but I'll tell you what I think. At the end of the day, you cannot prove anything. You cannot prove that morality is right. You cannot prove it. So if at the end of the day you're still skeptical, you're still cynical and say, well, Levinas, it's all very, very, very beautiful what you're saying. It's all, wow, it's mamish deep and, and I'm with you, but war is war and war is real and, let's not kid ourselves, right? So there is no argument against that, really. Levinas is doing the most that any human being can do, the most that, after all, Levinas is just a philosopher. Greater men than him, people like Isaiah and Yechezkel and Moses, who wrote greater books than philosophy books. They wrote prophetic works. Even they were unable to convince people that war is completely a temporary state of reality, a state of reality that can be overcome if only we're righteous enough, so as to bring about, so as to hasten the coming of the Messiah, and so as to truly beat all our swords and Uzis and M16s into plowshares. Even they weren't able to do it. So there is no philosophical refutation of this. It's not possible. At the same time, there's no philosophical refutation of the opposite either, right? How can you say that Levinas is wrong, really? Well, the most you can say is, well, he's just a very, very sanguine optimist. He's a very deep believer. And there have been many believers like him and people who are willing to die for their truths. And we're edified by stories like that. We don't laugh. When we hear stories of martyrs, even though it makes us sad and it makes us, and maybe, when I see a martyr story, my usual reaction is, well, I probably would never do that. I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't die for a cause. But at the same time, I can't help but feel, wow, that's a real human being. That's probably the greatest human achievement you can do, is die for your cause. You know, that which means that at some level I acknowledge that there is such a thing as seeing beyond war, beyond the evidence of war, beyond everything that's ugly. When a person puts their own life on the line and says, you know, I will die rather than do that, that's a very suggestive gesture, philosophically. That suggests that, well, maybe there is such a thing as an eschaton. And so in the end of the day, in the final analysis, you have the choice. You have to ask yourself, well, in which camp do I want to set up my tent? Will I set up my tent with Hobbes and Nietzsche and the cynics? And that's a very big camp. Or will I set up my tent with a very small camp of cockeyed optimists, you know, with all the tzaddikim and all the saints? But philosophically, there's no real way to choose one way or the other. But at least philosophically, you can clarify the decision.